If you've ever tried to rig up full hydraulic steering or even a hydro assist system on your rock crawler, you know that the most confusing and misunderstood part of the install is always going to be the hoses. If you ask about hydraulic hoses for hydraulic steering on a rock crawler on the internet, you're sure to get dozens of different answers and probably start a fight among the internet trolls. The most common questions I see are, what types of hoses do I use? And what size of hose do I use? In this video, I'll attempt to answer those questions for you. You'll need 3 types of hoses for your hydraulic steering system. High pressure hose, low pressure hose for your return line, and a suction or feed hose. It's critical that you match these 3 types of hoses perfectly for your given application. First of all, you want to make damn sure that you have a hose that's rated for petroleum-based hydraulic oil. Many hoses are only rated for water, fuel, air, or emissions. So make sure that the hose you use is compatible with your preferred steering fluid. Next, your hose needs to be rated for the working pressure of your power steering pump and must be able to handle the inevitable pressure spikes to the system when your 42-inch tires hit rocks really hard. Next, you need to consider working temperature. You know, the lower you can keep your hydraulic fluid temps, the better. This is why adding a cooler in the system should be considered mandatory. A proper running system with big tires while rock crawling usually gets to about 130 to 150 degrees, but add some air into the system or a blockage, and temps can easily shoot above 200 degrees in a heartbeat. So make sure your hoses are rated for 200 degrees or more. You know, I typically buy hose rated for 250 degrees or more to add a degree of safety margin. You must also be mindful to route your hydraulic hoses away from headers, collectors, and exhaust and other heat sources so they don't melt or degrade under heat. If they're anywhere close to any heat source, it's good to wrap them in some type of heat-resistant wrap or sleeve. And lastly, your hose needs to match the fittings. Regardless if you're using crimp-on fittings or reusable fittings, you must match the fittings to the hose. Hose brands and models and different models of hoses within the same brand all have different inside and outside diameters, different elasticity, and different layers of materials on them. Which means that only specific fittings work with specific types of hose. You know, don't use Parker fittings with Aeroquip hoses or Aeroquip fittings with Parker hoses and vice versa. You know, actually, even mini fittings of the same brand aren't compatible with hoses of the same brand. So the point here is never mix and match hoses and fittings. A good system always starts with the right suction hose for your feed line. The more your pump flows, the better the vacuum rating of your feed line needs to be. Also, the longer your feed hose is, the better the vacuum rating needs to be, which is one of the many reasons why your feed line into the pump should always be as short as possible. I've seen guys run hydro assist in their rigs with stock pumps for years with hose only rated for 15 inches of mercury. You know, and that might work fine for a low demand system, but for most guys, running full hydro, big tires, and high flow pumps, we should be running hose with a vacuum rating of over 25 inches of mercury on our feed line. I remember back in 2008, I bought a reservoir and hose kit from PSC to run hydraulic steering on my TJ. And I had nothing but problems with that system until I finally realized that PSC feed hose that they sent me that came with the kit was collapsing with my 1600 PSI pump. A collapsing feed line is a worst case scenario for your system. So arguably, this feed line and how you route it is probably the most important hose in your system. These are all -12 3/4 inch inside diameter hoses that people commonly run for feed lines on their hydraulic steering system, a feed into the pump. This hose right here is only rated at 15 inches of mercury, and you can see how easily it collapses. I would never run this hose as a suction line in any of my hydraulic steering systems. This hose would probably be okay for a return line, but I'd never run this for a suction or feed line into the pump. This is the Instagrip TC feed line that PSC currently sells with their kits. They don't give a vacuum rating on this line. Trust me, I've researched the hell out of this hose and I can't find a vacuum rating for it. But you could clearly see that it's harder to collapse than this hose rated at 15 inches of mercury. You can see that that's much harder to collapse. I think a hose like this should be fine for most applications out there. Then we have real suction hose. This is Parker 881 hose, and it basically tops out the inches of mercury scale and probably goes well beyond it. I can't even collapse this hose at all. It's that tough. If you're running one of these modern high flow race pumps, which typically flow, 7 gallons per minute, and a lot of them flow up to 12 gallons per minute at high RPMs. If you're running a pump like that, this is the hose I would use for my suction line. High pressure hoses should be rated well above the maximum pressure of the pump and must be rated with a burst pressure rating that will handle extreme pulses and pressure spikes in the system when your huge 42-inch tires inevitably smash into rocks. So I feel like a hose rated for 2000 PSI or more would give me a good safety margin. Also, I really like to use the Aeroquip FC300 hose for all of my high pressure lines. This hose is rated, between 2000 and 2300 PSI and has a burst pressure rating of 9000 PSI. This hose also has a temperature rating of 302 degrees Fahrenheit. So it'll perform well, under even the most extreme circumstances. And the beauty of this FC300 hose is that you can use various Aeroquip reusable and crimp-on fittings with the same hose. So it's also extremely versatile. The return hose is a low pressure hose that returns fluid from the orbital back to the reservoir. often with some type of fluid cooler somewhere in the middle of the line. You can use high pressure hoses and fittings for your return lines if you want to, but that gets very expensive very fast. The majority of people will opt for less expensive low pressure hose and push lock fittings for the return line. The Parker 801 push lock hose is a favorite of mine for this application. It's way overkill for the application because it has a pressure rating of 300 psi and a burst pressure rating of 1200 psi. It's also rated to handle fluid up to 257 degrees Fahrenheit. So if something goes wrong in your system, this hose is going to handle it. You know, even though it's tough, it's also very easy to work with and insert push lock fittings. Instagrip hose is also a popular option here. And it's also rated for 300 psi, but it's only rated for 190 degrees Fahrenheit versus this Parker hose, which is rated for 257 degrees. So keep that in mind. Hose size is very important and can have positive and negative effects on your system. Hose size must be in sync with your system's needs. This chart is basically the most widely used source for selecting the proper size hoses for your hydraulic steering system. There's also other nomograms that show the same thing, but might be easier for you to read. Basically, what these charts show is that when you move up in pump performance, you should also be stepping up in hose size as well. Feed and return line hose size can seem pretty complicated, but it's actually pretty simple. With most hydro assist systems running pumps with factory flow rates, and for full hydro rigs that'll be running factory pumps with smaller tires, a 6 AN return line and a 10 AN feed line are perfectly adequate most of the time. But when you move up to full hydraulic steering, big tires, and a high flow pump to make the whole thing work, and 8 AN return line and a 12 AN feed line are more appropriate for the high demands of the system. You know, you could see from the charts in the video that I just showed you a couple minutes ago that as soon as you get a better flowing pump, you should also be moving up to dash 12 feed line and dash 8 return line. The high pressure hose going from your pump to your orbital also follows the same principle. You know, a 6 AN line is fine for a stock pump, but when you install a high flow pump, you should bump this line up to 8 AN hose. The high pressure lines going from your orbital down to your steering ram can be left with 6 AN hose in my opinion. In fact, for most systems and your average 2.5-inch ram, a dash 6 hose is plenty. And this is pretty much how I run mine. A dash 12 feed line, a dash 8 return line, and dash 6 to the rams. You basically have 3 types of fittings you can use for your hydraulic steering system. You have crimp-on fittings, field serviceable or reusable fittings, and push-lock fittings. Crimp-style fittings are considered to be the strongest and surest of all the fittings, but unless you have an expensive crimping machine and lots of experienced crimping hoses, you have to have these specially made for you. Then we have the field serviceable or reusable fittings. These are very strong connections when done properly. and can greatly exceed the pressure rating of your typical hydraulic steering system. Even many of the big rigs in use today have these fittings from the factory on their trucks. You know, the real benefit of these fittings is that you can make your own hoses easily at home and easily repair broken lines and fittings on the trail. I prefer these fittings over the crimp fittings because of those reasons. And lastly, we have push lock fittings. You know, these should only be used for low pressure hose applications. Never use these on high pressure lines. These are very easy to use and low cost compared to the other fittings, but beware of cheap Chinese push lock fittings. You know, in my experience, many of those cheap fittings don't seal right, or the nut freezes at the flare and stops spinning. You know, many people even choose to use hose clamps with these as added insurance. You know, I really like the Aeroquip brand of these types of fittings. I think they're the best quality. Okay, and since I love these reusable fittings so much on my high pressure lines, I'm going to go ahead and show you how easy it is to install them properly. The first thing you're going to need is some soft jaws for your vise, because you know, you're going to have to clamp it really good and you don't want to destroy your hose or fittings. You know, they make things like these specifically made to hold AN fittings, but you know, after using these for a while, in retrospect, I don't really like these. My favorite soft jaws for the vise are these cheap plastic ones from, looks like JCL products, that I ordered off of Amazon. I don't know if you could see that. You know, they're pretty cheap, just a few dollars on Amazon, but I really like these soft jaws the best because they're made out of a very hard plastic, not a soft plastic, so they don't deform. They hold just as good as iron jaws do, but they don't destroy or mar the finish of what you're holding. So I really like these. Of course, they have magnets and just slip right on, and that's what I like. And when I cut this hose, I find that the cleanest cuts are with an angle grinder with a cutoff wheel on it. Really, I don't think anything I have, including my cable cutters, cut as clean as these on this hose. The next item you need is lubricant, grease or oil, to lube up the fittings and the hose for an easy and proper installation. The first thing I do when I get one of these reusable fittings is I screw it in all the way, just to make sure it screws in all the way. You know, once in a while, nobody's perfect, not even Eaton or Aeroquip, and once in a while you'll get a fitting where the threads are maybe boogered up a little bit, and you might need to chase those threads, but always try it out first. Make sure the threads are good. So next you're going to separate the fitting. You're going to put that in your vise, nice and snug. It doesn't need to be so tight you deform the fitting though, just nice and snug. Next, I'm going to grab my hose, and you know, it's beneficial if you don't have a dedicated good hose cutter, to cut this with a angle grinder with a cutoff disc. You know, you don't want this deformed. What I like to do is I like to stick a round file in there and kind of rough it out and smooth it up a little bit, and kind of chamfer the inside edge of this a little bit so it fits a little bit better. Then after I do that, I'm going to get a dab of grease, and I'm going to lightly grease up some of the outside of this hose a little bit here. So a little light layer of grease there. Don't need a whole lot. And we're ready to put this in the fitting. Okay, so with that greased up, we're ready to put it in this fitting. Be mindful when you screw this hose into this fitting, it's counterclockwise. Put that in there. And look in there to visibly inspect that the hose has bottomed out on the inside lip of the fitting. And once that's the case, I put it back in the vise and I back it off about a quarter to a third of a turn. And that part's done. And now I'm going to show you an alternate way of putting these reusable fittings on. Sometimes your hoses are just too damn long. I mean, if you're running, making a rear steer hose, for instance, and your directional control valve is on your dashboard, and you have to run a line all the way to the ram on your rear axle, that's just too long of a damn hose to push the hose into the fitting and twist it in. So this is an alternative method I use on longer hoses. Basically, I clamp the hose into the soft jaws, you know, not too tight. You don't want to damage the braiding on the hose, but just clamp it in, then put the fitting on the top, then grab the appropriate size socket, put it on the fitting, and remember, with this fitting right here, counterclockwise is tightened. So I have it set for that, and kind of hold the hose and push down on the wrench. See, it screws right on. Goes right in. Go all the way down till you feel it bottom. And I felt it bottom there. Then it's always a great idea to have a flashlight handy so you can make sure the fitting bottomed out. And it looks like I actually have a little bit more to go there. I'm going to give this a couple more cranks. And it's bottomed out now. So that's just an alternative method for doing it. I know most hose guys prefer to twist the hose on by hand into the fitting, but like I said, sometimes your hoses are just too damn long, and this alternative method works out better for you. Okay, so the next thing you're going to do, you're going to put that back in the vise lightly, making sure you don't crush the fitting, but it's in there nice and tight. You're going to get this piece. You're going to oil that up nice and good, grease it up. Remember, you need to grease this. Don't miss that step. Push it into the hose until you start grabbing threads. And this is clockwise to tighten on this piece. And once you get it to grab and it's threading in, it's time to grab a wrench. And I personally prefer a ratcheting wrench for this part. I usually put a little bit of pressure on the top and start threading it in. Now you'll notice on a lot of these, as you're threading it in, the fitting starts getting a little hot. It's not a big deal, just keep going. Don't stop till you're there. Remember, these are really fine threads, so it takes a little while to bottom out on it. See what I'm doing? I'm putting thumb pressure on the top and turning the wrench. And there you have it. A completed reusable fitting. Ready to run hydraulic steering. Oh, and before I forget, a last and very important step is to clear your hose out with compressed air really good. You do not want little pieces of rubber and debris floating around in there. You know, in the hydraulic world, cleanliness is godliness. You need to keep these clean. So next we'll delve into the world of push lock fittings. Probably the biggest mistake I see with people putting these things together is they don't lube them properly. You know, I just give them a little dip in grease right there. And, you know, most of these, you can use your muscle and force it on. If not, you know, you could put it on a flat surface like this and just work it onto there like that. But, you know, these are pretty easy to put in. And, you know, if you're using a thicker hose or a hose rated for higher pressures, you know, sometimes you got to put the edge of these in and kind of work them around and work them in there a little bit. But they're not too hard. Also, if you plan on using hose clamps, a lot of times slip that hose clamp on first before you do this. But just show you kind of how easy this is. And there you go. A properly installed push lock fitting. Well, I really tried to keep this video brief and easy to understand. If I confused you, it's pretty much your fault because you won't get an easier explanation for selecting hydraulic steering hoses than what I just gave you. Just be mindful that you'll need feed, return, and high pressure hoses for your system. And the size of these hoses will depend on the flow of your pump. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video and it helped clarify a few things for you. And as always, thanks for watching and keep the rubber side down.